Good evening, I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, July 5th. We begin tonight with the latest developments on the historic European expansion of NATO. All 30 NATO members have signed off on letting Finland and Sweden into the military alliance. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg calls it a historic moment. The move further isolates Russia following its invasion of neighboring Ukraine in February. But it still requires parliamentary approval from all NATO members. That includes Turkey, whose president has warned of potential political trouble. Back at home, an independent think tank says the Bank of Canada's strategy to wrestle soaring inflation back under control is likely to cause a recession. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives says rapidly raising interest rates to lower inflation from 7.7% to the 2% target could cause significant collateral damage. This includes 850,000 job losses. It also notes that a 5.7 percentage point drop in the inflation rate has happened 3 times over the past 60 years, each time after big rate hikes and accompanied by a recession. On the West Coast, the Assembly of First Nations began its annual meeting in Vancouver today, but the organization's leader, who said she had been erased from the agenda, still attended. Roseanne Archibald has been suspended from her post, but she still attended the meeting, led the opening ceremonies, and welcomed attendees in her opening address. Ms. Archibald alleges she is being targeted for trying to investigate corruption within the AFN. Turning to the case of Chinese-Canadian billionaire Xiao Jianhua. The federal government says Chinese authorities refused to let diplomats attend Mr. Xiao's trial. A statement from Ottawa says Canada made several requests to attend, but was denied by Chinese authorities. Mr. Xiao is the founder of Tomorrow Group, which has been linked to a series of anti-corruption prosecutions and seizures of financial companies. He was last seen at a Hong Kong hotel in January 2017 and was believed to have been taken to the mainland by Chinese authorities. A 2-week strike at Canadian National Railway is ending after the union agreed to binding arbitration. The company says 750 signals and communications workers will return to their roles on Wednesday morning. The International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers had initially rejected the railway's proposal for binding arbitration. They say the company's concessions didn't go far enough. But a spokesman for the IBEW says the time was right to take that step now. All right, moving to the city of Toronto, which says it will ensure all of its security contractors accommodate and rehire laid-off Sikh employees. This comes after some were removed from their positions because of their facial hair. The World Sikh Organization had complained to the city on behalf of more than 100 security guards who said they were required to wear N95 masks sealed directly to the face. The rule doesn't allow for facial hair, which puts it in conflict with a core tenet of the Sikh faith. The Sikh group says contractors laid off some Sikh guards and moved others to alternate sites with demotions in rank and salary. Canadian historian Irving Abella has died. The co-author of a seminal book on the Canadian government's refusal to accept Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust died on Sunday. This was the day after his 82nd birthday after a long illness. The Toronto native's 1982 book, None is Too Many, co-written by Harold Tropper, shed light on Canada's anti-immigrant policies toward Jews. All right, well, meanwhile, a humanitarian flight carrying 230 refugees from Russia's war in Ukraine arrived in Regina last night. They were accompanied by a woman whose photo 50 years ago came to symbolize the horrors of another war. A Saskatchewan government spokesman confirms Phan Thi Kim Phuc was aboard the flight carrying Ukrainian citizens from Warsaw to Canada. She was the girl in the famous 1972 Vietnam napalm attack photo. An Associated Press report noted the 59-year-old, who is a Canadian citizen, traveled with her husband from Toronto to board the humanitarian flight. The report said she wants her story and work for refugees to be a message of peace. Turning to Manitoba now, where a group of people in a city near a military base is encouraging locals to fill in postcards for troops deployed to Latvia. The group Brandon Salutes is encouraging people to pick up the postcards at the Brandon Chamber of Commerce office or at Kirst Coffee Company in Shiloh. Hundreds of troops from CFB Shiloh have been heading overseas to take part in Operation Reassurance. This is where the Canadian Armed Forces are conducting training exercises and other tasks. The postcards will be collected July 15th for a mass mailing overseas. Up next, we take a deeper look at NATO accession for Finland and Sweden. Stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break on Forum Daily. The latest developments in Sweden and Finland's bids to join NATO saw all 30 NATO allies sign off on the accession protocols. This sends their membership bids to the alliance capitals for legislative approvals. The 30 ambassadors and permanent representatives formally approved decisions made at a NATO summit in Madrid last week, but securing parliamentary approval for the new members in Turkey could still pose a problem. The country's president warned last week that Ankara could block the process. Well, with us now to unpack this is Dr. Devlen, foreign policy expert and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. Devlen, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me again.
Now, the signing off on accession protocols happened just days after Turkey withdrew its veto over the expansion. However, Turkey still warns that it could still block the process. So what sort of demands is Turkey making, and will these Nordic nations be able to oblige?
There are a few things that were put forward by Turkey. One was the primary one, was about extradition of certain names that Turkey demanded from both Sweden and Finland. Primarily targeting PKK, the Kurdish terrorist organization, and alleged members of those organizations, as well as Gülenists who were implicated and accused by Turkey of carrying out the military coup attempt back in 2016. To be frank, Finland really got caught in the middle. The real beef between Turkey and Sweden, and Turkey has been critical of Swedish support for what they consider to be terrorist organizations and others. So this was an opportunity to be able to get that. So that's number one. Number two was this informal arms embargo that both countries were imposing on Turkey, and that would be lifted. Those were the two primary things, and I'm pretty sure there was also a talk of speeding up the F-16 purchases from the U.S. So, but that was not necessarily part of the official communique and the memorandum of understanding that was signed. And the deal was basically that Sweden and Finland said that they will work with Turkey in terms of extraditing those names, but within, of course, their laws and regulations. So we'll see whether that would go through. As you pointed out, there is now the ratification process, which is the last sort of step, and we might still see some drama over there.
And we know the next step is parliamentary approval. So what will that entail?
So every country have their own sort of legal system of ratifying the new members. In Turkey, it would go to the parliament, and the parliament would need to ratify the agreement that will allow Sweden and Finland be NATO members. Given that President Erdogan's coalition, his party, and the Nationalist Action Party, which is sort of the coalition that supports in the parliament President Erdogan, have the majority. If there is basically a green light from Erdogan, that would go through. Now, what I would expect is that there will be another round of drama over there at that time, and see whether there are further demands that are coming from Turkey, or whether the demands were sufficiently met by Sweden and Finland, and this would go through. But expect another round of drama and coming down to the wire at the end of the ratification process.
Sounds like a lot of drama to be expected, Dr. Devlen. Now, if this expansion were to go through, we know NATO forces may be at the Finnish-Russian border. So what does this mean for Mr. Putin's war in Ukraine?
Well, hopefully it will mean that will stretch their capabilities, although Putin was a bit nonchalant about the membership, saying that this doesn't necessarily impact Russia, but turned around and they said if there are NATO bases or nuclear weapons, that they will have to act. I would say that whatever the official line is, they would now have to consider that they have a much longer northern border with NATO, and that would tie down some of the Russian forces, at least ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities there, which should have a negative impact on Russia's fight in Ukraine. But we will see whether in the long term, whether that would change their force posture.
All right, Dr. Devlen, a really quick 30 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on in this process?
Well, the thing I'm really keeping my eye on is whether the next sort of round of drama and negotiations between Turkey and NATO and Sweden and Finland will lead to another breakthrough at the last minute, or whether Erdogan push for a harder bargain. My sense is that it will come down to the wire, but Erdogan will concede, and this will be ratified, and Finland and Sweden will be members of NATO.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Devlen, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, we'll examine the impacts that war and violence can have on a child's education. Stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. The violence in Ukraine continues to make headlines around the world as concerns rise around how long Russia's invasion of the country could last. But one organization is pointing to the deeper impact of war on the future generations of countries plagued with conflict. According to Yasmine Sherif, Director of Education Cannot Wait, the UN's Global Fund for Education in Emergencies, Ukraine is one of many crisis countries facing targeted attacks on education. The organization points to the 222 million crisis-affected children worldwide that are in need of educational support. And this violence around schools has a lasting impact on not only the futures of children in such countries, but the futures of the countries themselves. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Ms. Yasmine Sherif herself. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with the war in Ukraine, ma'am. How has this violence impacted education and schools in the country in particular?
Well, it's had a terrifying, devastating impact. Over 700 schools have been targeted, and it appears that there have been intentional targeting of education facilities, which of course is prohibited under international law. We are speaking about a school-age population of 5.7 million children and adolescents who are affected by this conflict. We have 2.2 million among them who are in urgent need of education support. They can't go to school. The schools are being bombed. There's destruction, and the overall danger of that conflict forces them on into remote learning, either across the border or from home, but even that is not sufficient when infrastructure is being destroyed.
And unfortunately, Ukraine is one of the many crisis-affected countries where schools could be the target of violence. Why are schools the target of violence in the first place?
Well, first of all, schools are targeted around the globe. We see it in Nigeria, we see it in Cameroon, we see it in the Sahel, and during the conflict in Syria and so forth. And we see it even in Afghanistan, where girls' secondary education is being affected. Warring parties either intentionally targeted because it's a way of breaking down the social fabric, making sure that the next generation is not educated. They use it to store weapons or use it to launch attacks, which is also prohibited under international law. So often, I would say frequently, it's the children and the youth of a society that are the immediate target, suffering the brunt of an armed conflict.
And considering that children are our future, and I know you just touched on this a little bit, but how does all of this impact the future progress of these crisis-affected countries?
Well, you know, I travel a lot, and I went to Moldova and I met with refugee children and youth arriving there with their mothers. I've traveled across the Sahel, Mali, Chad, South Sudan, in Afghanistan, around the globe. You see children and young people who are traumatized, distraught, and are falling behind in their learning. And as a result, they are exposed to other dangers in a much greater, to a much greater extent. Girls are married away at a very young age. unwanted pregnancies. They're forced into trafficking, which is part of the war economy. Boys are drawn in to militias, terrorist groups, or armies, becoming child soldiers rather than pursuing an education. And as a result, because today a new report by Education Cannot Wait shows that there are 222 million children and adolescents in conflicts, in forced displacement and climate-induced disasters who are no access to a quality education. 222 million dreams risk being lost and turned into devastating consequences as those I have outlined. And that will have an impact, a consequence on all of us, whether we live in the Sahel or we live in Canada, the United States, or in Europe. We are all going to be affected by it.
Some really heartbreaking information there, ma'am. Just about 30 seconds left here, but what can our Canadian viewers do to help?
Well, Canada is a generous country of great solidarity. Education Cannot Wait is the United Nations Global Fund for Education in Conflict and Crisis. We have a high-level conference, pledging conference, financing conference hosted by the government of Switzerland together with Germany, Canada, Niger, and South Sudan in Geneva, Switzerland in February 2023. Join our movement.
Police say that their suspect planned the shooting at a July 4th parade that left 7 people dead and dozens more injured. Yesterday's attack in a Chicago suburb had been planned by the suspect for several weeks. Robert Crimo III was an aspiring rapper with the stage name Awake the Rapper. He accessed the rooftop via a fire escape ladder and fired more than 70 rounds towards the crowd. He disguised himself in women's clothing while fleeing arrest. Moving to the war in Ukraine, where the mayor of a city in the path of Russia's offensive is telling residents to evacuate. The warning was underscoring fears that Russian forces are poised to advance further into Ukraine's Donbas region. The mayor of Sloviansk says shelling damaged 40 houses in the city on Monday. Well, as tensions rise between the two Central African countries, a Congolese government spokesman says President Felix Tshisekedi will meet with his Rwandan counterpart in Angola. Patrick Muyaya told the Associated Press on Tuesday that the two leaders will discuss bilateral relations in the armed conflict in eastern Congo. This is where M23 rebels took a town near the Uganda border last month. Congolese officials have asserted that M23 is backed by Rwanda, and they have accused the much smaller neighbor of occupying Congolese territory. Rwanda has long denied supporting M23, disputing the accounts of UN experts. Moving to France now, where authorities say they have repatriated 51 women and children from former Islamic State-controlled areas in Syria. The National Anti-Terrorist Prosecutor's Office said the repatriation on Tuesday is the single largest return of women and children to France from camps in northeastern Syria since the territorial defeat of the Islamic State group in March 2019. French jihadis made the largest contingent of European recruits. 2 senior ministers in the British cabinet have quit in a move that could spell the end of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's leadership. Chancellor Rishi Sunak and Health Secretary Sajid Javid resigned within minutes of each other on Tuesday. Their departures follow months of scandals for the Johnson government. Most recently, the Prime Minister has been accused of failing to come clean about a lawmaker who was appointed to a senior position despite claims of sexual misconduct. The war in Ukraine has abruptly drawn millions of dollars away from longer-running humanitarian crises. Somalia is perhaps the most vulnerable, as thousands die of hunger amid the driest drought in decades. Aid funding for Somalia is less than half of last year's level. This comes as donors, overwhelmingly from the West, have sent more than $1.7 billion to respond to the war in Europe. China is sweltering under the worst heat wave in decades. China's weather agency says the average temperature across the nation rose to its highest since 1961. And northeastern provinces saw the most June rainfall ever recorded. Extreme heat is also battering Japan in what scientists say has all the hallmarks of climate change. Moving to Sydney, Australia, where officials say hundreds of homes have been flooded in and around the area. Emergency response teams made 100 rescues overnight of people trapped in cars, on submerged roads, or in inundated homes. Days of torrential rain have caused dams to overflow and waterways to break their banks. It is the fourth flood emergency in 16 months for parts of the city of 5 million. More developments come following a powerful avalanche that killed 7 in Italy. Rescuers are finding body parts and equipment as they search for missing hikers. Officials initially feared 13 were still missing, but later reduced the number of people unaccounted for to 5. 7 people are known to have died when a huge chunk of a glacier cleaved off on Sunday. This sent torrents of ice, rock, and debris down a mountainside onto unsuspecting hikers below. Rain hampered the search yesterday, but sunny weather allowed helicopters to bring more rescue teams up to the site today. Researchers in Finland have developed the world's first working sand battery, and it can store green energy for months at a time, according to a BBC report. Sand batteries work by being charged up with heat made from solar or wind generators and using low-grade sand to store the heat. The sand stores the heat at around 500 degrees Celsius, which can then be used to warm homes throughout the winter when energy is at its most expensive. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You could also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you next time. Take care, Canada.